Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Continual Panel Room and the Comics Lair. The Continual Comics Lair is sponsored by Heroes Aren't Hard to Find and its annual Heroes Convention. I'm Nancy Northcott, the director of the Comics Lair, and I'm delighted to welcome two of the writers from the Legion of Superheroes 5 Years Later project, Mary and Tom Bierbaum. So welcome, y'all, and let's start with talking about just what is the Legion of Superheroes anyway?
Yeah, the Legion started in DC Comics in the late 1950s. Kind of initially just a gimmick story. Superboy had an ongoing series. In fact, I think he had two at that point, Adventure Comics and Superboy. And they had an episode where he came across these three youths from the future, and he got recruited into I think at the time of that initial story, I can't remember, it was 21st century or 30th century superhero group. And it was a gimmick story. Superboy got into the group after a lot of misadventures during his initiation test. And it was a one-shot story. I don't think they ever intended to repeat it, but fan interest was such that I'm sure they kept getting questions in the letters, when are you going to bring the Legion back? When are you going to bring the Legion back? So they started bringing them back, and eventually they became so popular, they became an ongoing series in the 1960s, and they've been going almost nonstop through the current day, and really hit their peak in the 80s. For a couple of years, they were one of DC's top selling books. And yeah, continuing to this day after a hiatus, there's a new Legion out there on the market right now as well.
So the Legion of Superheroes obviously has a long history. And I think if you talk to people at conventions, they'll tell you that Legion fans are kind of a cult. They're just rabid about it, or I should say we, since I happen to be one of them. Why do you think people like the series so much?
I think a lot of it is just that it's more intense than most of what went before it, in the sense of, Superman comic had one hero, Batman had a hero and a sidekick. Even the Justice League was, whatever it was, 8, 10 characters. The Legion was dozens, literally dozens of heroes. And so, if you were just wanting to skim into something and read an issue once a year or something, you weren't going to be attracted to that. But, it was just the weight, it was just superheroes to the nth degree. And, it takes a certain amount of loyalty and focus and fanaticism to master who all the characters are, who all the protagonists are.
And the characters were youths. They were young. They were teenagers, and the audience, I can't identified with them. So
yeah, that was a little ahead of its time, in the sense that other than Superboy and sidekicks, I'm not sure how many teen superheroes were really lead characters until the Legion came along. We're used to it now these days with the Teen Titans and Spider-Man as a teenager, but that was quite a bit a different take in 1957.
Well, and there's such a variety of heroes in the Legion. One of the things that was interesting to me about Legion fandom is pick a Legionnaire, any Legionnaire, and it's somebody's favorite. It'll also be somebody's least favorite. So it was an interesting exercise, I think, in tolerance, being a Legion fan and learning to get along with other people's ideas.
Yep.
The group seemed to roll along in pretty much the same vein for a long time. I mean, they were in futuristic metropolis, and they were the heroes of the galaxy, and they were respected and admired. And then along comes 5 years later. And it's a very different concept of the Legion. It's a dystopian future where the Legion has been disbanded. They're not popular in some quarters publicly and with the government. And it's very much a rebuilding story. Can you tell us a little bit about how that concept came about?
Yeah, I think what had happened was you had many years, really, to a lot of fans, I think the golden years of Legion history, where Paul Levitz was writing, and Paul knew and knows the Legion history as well as anyone, and is a great writer to boot. The Legion had this golden age. Keith Giffen was involved in several of the top years. But after many, many years of that run, I think there was a sense that the readers and the concept were ready for a change. And when Paul finally was ready to move on, they offered to pass the baton on to Keith. And I think Keith's sense, and he can speak obviously better to this than we can, but our understanding is Keith felt like it was time to really try a new approach, to really shake things up. So I think he felt like the Legion had done what it could do as the kind of group you were describing, Nancy, and that now it was time to kind of, throw it up in the air and have the pieces fall in a lot of different places and then start picking them up again. So it was really Keith's inspiration and the restlessness of Keith's creativity. One thing you'll notice about Keith Giffen is he really doesn't like to repeat himself. And he had participated in some of the best Legion stories, I think most fans would say, of all time, but he didn't want to go back and do those over. He wanted to do something fresh and new, and Brother was the 5 years later, fresh and new.
Well, why the dystopian setting? Is there a particular reason for that?
I don't know that I have an answer for that. That would be, I think, just more probably Keith's desire to express what the Legion is about by showing them reclaim what they're about. So you wipe away what the Legion stood for, and then you show the group fighting back and reestablishing what they stand for that had now been wiped away.
So how did you all end up with this gig?
Yeah, we had been writing some with Keith. Keith knew us through the APAs that you and we participated in, and Keith briefly interacted with the Legion fandom of the day, and he got to know some of the people in the group. I sent him some uniform suggestions that he used one of them in the comic, and we got to know each other. And he knew that we were trying to break into the comic writing business, and we had done a few things with Keith. So when he was, offered this great opportunity to take the Legion in a new direction, he wanted to, draw the thing and be the plotter, but he felt probably not accurately that he needed a dialoguer. I think, Keith at that time, felt like it was a good idea to let someone else handle the dialogue at his stage as a writer, when in reality, I think he could have pulled it off quite nicely, but he didn't. So he, told the editors there were certain candidates of people he'd like to work with as dialoguers, and we were on the list, and we prevailed, and we were thrilled to get the opportunity.
That sounds really great. And I think for a lot of Legion fans, it took a little getting used to because it was so different. But I was reading some of the earlier issues today, some of the early issues in that run. And I really admired the way you kind of set these little threads up. And I know you did this in collaboration with Keith, and you all worked on it together. So, but you set up these little threads that would come to fruition down the line. So obviously there was a lot of advanced planning with these stories. Can you tell us a little bit about the creative process?
Yeah, and the thing, had gotten rolling somewhat before we came on board. Keith had begun to work on it. He was, and collaboration is a word you used in the question, is a really important one with many of the things Keith does. He really has an enormous collaborative energy that he really enjoys taking other people's ideas, kicking them around, seeing where they go, giving his creative partners an opportunity to participate and to throw in their ideas. So when we came on board, he and Al Gordon, the inker, had already been talking about some of the characters and some of the plot lines that could, that they were thinking of. And by the time we got on, I remember Keith would get on the phone oftentimes with me, many times with both of us, And I remember when we first got on, we would talk for like 2 or 3 hours and he'd say, okay, here's what Colossal Boy is up to in this future. Here's what Saturn Girl's up to. Here's what, you know, Chemical King is. Well, he was gone. But at any rate, he was talking about all these different plot threads. And then every once in a while, we would say, you know, that's an interesting idea for this character, but, you know, here's an idea. Would you be interested? And as often as not, he'd say, yeah, sure. And the best example of that is he had a storyline for my favorite character, Tenzel Chem Matter Eater Lad. And he had a storyline at that point. Tenzel was in the Bismalian Senate and he was going to do some kind of a political scandal sort of a thing. And I said, well, that's pretty interesting. I said, but, you know, I've always had this idea of Tenzel as kind of a humorous character, kind of a tongue-in-cheek, you know, wisecracking character. And Keith said, great, do it. And so we started plotting some of the storylines we ended up using with Tenzel. And that was just the way it went. As Keith was explaining what they were hoping to do and what they were mapping out, if you had an idea, throw it in there. And, you know, very often he would, he'd go along with it and say, you know, okay, that's for you to do, you know, make sure you do a good job of it.
Well, now that you bring up characters, there was quite a bit of change among the characters from their, I guess we could call them their classic incarnations, to the ones in the 5 years later. And one of the characters who kind of got short shrift in the classic universe, despite a really intriguing origin story, was Ron Vidar. So how did you come to use Ron as much as you did?
I do not remember any of this. It's just like Tom's telling me and I'm like, oh, okay. I don't remember. I just know that I liked Ron Vidar and he was one of my favorites. And the Green Lantern aspect was really cool. And
yeah,
it was just cool.
Yeah, yeah, you're wearing the yeah. Ron Vidar Green Lantern shirt as we speak. Yeah, the anecdote that I was trying to jog Mary's memory about earlier this evening was in the 3rd issue of the series, Keith was showing Ron Vidar being very horribly killed. And he had been captured by Mordru, and Mordru had a mystical character that was literally eating him alive, eating Ron Vidar alive. And we're on the phone with Keith as he's going through the pages that we have to now dialogue. And he says, so this is what's happened to Ron Vidar. He's being eaten alive. And Mary was on the line and you just heard this wailing sound. and Keith's like, oh, I take it you're not very fond of this plot development. And on the spot, we talked him into not killing off Ron Vidar. And we did not have to come up with a substitute person. He kept him alive. And I think he said, but you have to do something with him, which I think that's what led to him hooking up with Laurel Gann. But that was a few issues later. Laurel didn't exist yet. So that took us a few more issues to figure out to do that with Ron. But I remember Keith saying, I can always tell when the Bierbaums don't like what I'm suggesting. If it's Mary, you hear this wail. If it's Tom, you hear this dead silence on the other end of the line. So he got to know our reactions pretty well.
We know as we're talking about it, it occurs to me that newer fans of the Legion who maybe came on board with SW6 or Legion Lost or even the Legion and Supergirl might not be familiar with Ron's origin story. Can you just lay that out there for anybody who's not familiar with it?
Yeah, he back in the 1960s, he appeared 2 times, and I'm trying to remember the exact order, but the Legion met him at literally a science fair, and he had invented the time cube. Legion already had time bubbles, but he invented the time cube. And through the course of the story, that was the one where Universo there was a villain named Universo, and he sent the Legionnaires back in time. And I believe Ron helped retrieve them. And at the end of the story, we find the heartbreaking news that Ron is the son of the villain Universo. And there was a second appearance about that time, but I'm a little hazy on exactly the details. But basically, he came into the continuity as the son of this villain. And Ron was a scientific genius, and he formed a bond with Brainiac 5, and they did a lot of experimentation together and explored the time stream together and so forth.
It just always seemed to me that with that origin story being the son of one of the greatest supervillains of, I think at the time it was the 30th century, there was so much potential to do more with him.
Yeah.
And you all did do a lot more with him without actually pegging him to Universo. You kind of set him off and gave him an independent existence. Yeah. Was that a deliberate choice, or is that just the way the stories led you?
I would say it more was just an organic thing of how the stories played out, because I think there was a lot of story fodder there if we had them intersect, but Universo was just kind of off in a different corner at this point. And that was, I thought, one of the coolest things that Keith did in the way it set things up. As you've alluded to, on Earth, the government has become quite dystopian. And you gradually find out it's an authoritarian state, and it's not being in any way honest with the population. And there's an underground, a noble underground with a lot of ex-Legionnaires and ex-substitute heroes who are fighting to free Earth. There's also an underground being run by Universo. And it's like, yeah, real villains wouldn't say, oh yeah, I want to have this authoritarian government, impose its will on me. Most criminals would be every bit as eager to get rid of those shackles as the heroes would be. So Keith had Universo running one of two major underground organizations on Earth. And we just never really got the opportunity to cross Ron over with Universo, unfortunately.
Well, speaking of underground organizations, the Ultra Boy of 5 years later is kind of an underground kingpin, and he interacts with a character you created. Could you tell us a little bit about Kono and about the setup with Ultra Boy and his network?
Wow, I don't.
Well, I'll handle the Ultra Boy part in that when Keith was talking with Al as they set up this universe, the subject of Ultra Boy came up, the character Joe Na, and Al suggested that he be kind of the guy in Harrison Ford in Star Wars.
Han Solo.
Han Solo. I kept wanting to say Lando Calrissian. Han Solo, kind of a Han Solo-ish character. And so that gave Keith the idea that Joe was on his home planet Rimbor, again, an oppressive government, a corrupt government, and Joe was running a smuggling ring.
And we were all allowed to create a character. And I'm not sure how Kono came about. I know that she was named because she liked to drink Kono juice, but she said everything was Kono juice when it was hard alcohol. And
that she wasn't yet of age.
She wasn't of age. And she was just, I guess, I don't know, I wanted to bring in a kind of a feisty young woman who had a mind of her own, and I'm not sure how she got teamed up with Joe.
I think that was pretty much Keith.
Yeah.
Just as a collaborator, Keith was very generous. And when we made up characters, he put them right in the action right away.
Yeah.
And so that was the second issue. He was going to tell Joe's story, and there was Kono, in there right away. And again, I think, for one thing, she fit right in because you had chosen to make her part of the Sklarian pirates.
Right.
And so she came from a tradition of piracy, and here's Joe as a smuggler. So it just fit perfectly.
We know her powers were interesting because it seemed that her ability to manipulate mass kind of made her a combination of, and tell me if you don't think this is a fair comparison, of Phantom Girl and Starboy.
Yeah, to a degree.
Yeah.
And which is total coincidence. The power was just you came up with it. And at the time, you had no idea she would be hooked up with Joe.
Right.
And people thought, oh, she's just supposed to be Phantom Girl. It's like total coincidence. There's no linkage between Phantom Girl's power and Kono's power. And then, yeah, the Starboy, yeah, they use that as the explanation for how he makes things heavy. And I guess Kono could make things heavy too, theoretically. But that, again, more of a coincidence that happens to be the way they explain Starboy's power. But, this was just an inspiration you had for a power that's really useful, fun to write, and really gives her a lot of things she can do with that power.
Oh yeah, when the bad guys hate a character, the character is really very effective.
Yes.
So what was the character that each of you had the most fun playing with? Just pure enjoyment of doing it.
I'm going to have to say I really liked working with Computo. I really liked her, and I was really disappointed that we didn't get to do more with her. So, yeah.
Yeah, which was the character Danielle Fokar.
Yeah.
And she had appeared in the run of the book in the mid 80s as the younger sister of another character, Jacques Fokar. And it was your inspiration that she would have aged into the Legion age range about the time we were writing the spinoff book, Legionnaires. And again, Mary's inspiration to say, let's use her and use what they had shown happen to this little girl manifest as a useful power for the Legionnaires. And yeah, that.
Yeah. I was like, oh man, I like that. I like that girl.
And I thought her personality came together, and she meshed in a really interesting way. A lot of action between her and the Legionnaires, who had you didn't know where they came from, but the younger Legionnaires were apparently either clones or in some way they were taken out of the Legion's past. And then you had Danielle be kind of the futuristic person bouncing off of these people from the Legion's past. And yeah, I think she meshed quite well in that sense. And for me, the easy answer is Tenzil Kem was just, for me, so much fun to write. We got to write stories that were, designed to be humorous. We got to write some stories that just were wacky and crazy and, really stretched the bounds of, plausibility for the sake of being humorous. And for me, that was really a lot of fun. But I loved writing all the characters. My brothers and I, in my teen years, and my brothers being younger than me, we did homemade comics in the 1970s. And, you felt like you knew all these characters, and it was such a hoot to one day actually write them and see them grow and see them become become adult people, versions of what you were writing, at home on your kitchen table, 20 years earlier. So that was a lot of fun.
Well, speaking of the characters aging and developing between in the 5-year gap, there was a really interesting dynamic that you set up between Shrinking Violet and Cosmic Boy, and you kicked it off in the very first issue. Could you tell the readers a little about that?
Yeah, and again, all credit to Keith. This was 99% his storyline, and were lucky enough to, in some of the fill-ins and other stories we did, to advance the storyline some, and of course wrote most of the dialogue of it. But yeah, absolutely Keith's idea that at the start of the story, and really pivotal because he really used Cosmic Boy the character whose civilian name is Rock, as a key character, as a foundational character for the Legion. And you start the story, not immediately, but most of the first issue is Rock. And you find out that his home planet is basically occupied by an alien force. They've lost a war, and it's a really bleak situation on his home planet of Brawl. And you find out that they had a war with the home planet of Shrinking Violet, Imsk. And it gradually unfolds that Rock was part of this horrible event where a terrible weapon has been used by the Imskians against the Brillians. And what people didn't know at the time, when it happened, Rock ended up being wounded, and in a haze thought he was reporting to his own army when he had wandered into the Imskian army. And through a misunderstanding and through his not knowing what's going on, he tries to attack the Imskians. And I believe Violet tried to defend him. She lost her eye because Rock, again, in a haze, he's wounded. He actually wounded her, caused her to lose her eye. But Violet was in a situation where she had been head of security for the unleashing of this terrible weapon. And once she realized the tragedy that had occurred, just the slaughter of thousands of Brillians, she became an opponent of Imsk War. She got thrown in the stockade, she got court-martialed, etc. But she couldn't forgive herself for what she had done to Brawl and what she had done to Cosmic Boy. Meanwhile, Cosmic Boy feels this burden of guilt that he had joined his army and he was fighting in this unjust, pointless war. And the two of them were kind of avoiding each other. Finally, Violet works up the courage to apologize to Rock. And he's like, "You're apologizing to me?" And they both, realize they're both carrying this tremendous guilt of having participated in a pointless war, having caused, all this suffering. And it's, for me, a really effective story of, forgiveness, of, acceptance, of, letting people know it's okay that they made a mistake, that we can get past that and move on and accept each other. And Violet went on to use that lesson when she was holding a grudge against another character who had done something inadvertently that was very harmful to her in earlier years. And we showed her forgiving that other character who had impersonated her at a time that ended up being very costly to Violet. And after this mutual forgiveness that occurred after this other war, Violet was able to forgive the person who had wronged her. So it was a powerful storyline.
Well, and it's an example of how you can take characters who are friends and change the dynamic so that the friendship matters in a different way. Yeah. It's like the relationship between Brainy and Laurel, or maybe relationship between Brainy and Laurel. But the way that played out with Brainy and Laurel and the other character involved in that managed to create tension and emotional conflict, but not destroy friendships. And it looking back at the issues that I read again recently, it seems to me that these are actually very character-driven stories. Would you say that's a fair description?
Yeah, very much so. I think when we branched off later into the Legionnaires, we made the Legionnaires a little more story-driven, a lot of character there, but we were, really trying to simplify the story and bring in potentially a younger audience. But during the 5 years later run, I think everything that Keith did was started from character. And as you say, it's really a little more interesting how the characters get along and how they manage to be different, but still be, extremely close friends than, how they save the universe. Saving the universe is interesting, but yeah, the characters are really what make the story fly.
So was there any character that when you saw him or her in the outline for the story that you were going to script that you went, oh no, how are we going to do this? Any character that was consistently a challenge, I guess is what I'm asking.
Good question. I don't, I think there were characters we sort of never got around to figuring out. I think for me, the toughest characters were the ones that other teammates had created, because all of a sudden you're writing someone else's character. With all the Legionnaires, there was a sense, the long-term members, there was a sense of, I've known these characters for 20 or 30 years, and I can just sort of figure out what they would do. But then when we were writing characters that Al had created, or Keith introduced some characters, and then all of a sudden you're feeling like, boy, what would this character do? Jason Pearson, the penciler, created a character, Sade. And again, those were a challenge to figure out what to do with them, because you really pretty much had to go to the creators and say, what did you have in mind for this character? What were you envisioning? But the other characters, for me, they pretty much fell into place. I can't think of too many that were real big challenge.
We know one character who's very different from his classic incarnation is Mordru. Can you tell us a little bit about how all of you, the creative team, developed Mordru and kind of arrived at this concept for him? Because it was interesting.
Yeah, the biggest thing with Mordru in our run, from my perspective, was that back in the 70s, Jim Shooter wrote a story that introduced Pulsar Stargrave as a character, and the story got handed off to one or two other writers, and it never followed through on Jim Shooter's original concept. But initially, he was presented, I believe, as Brainiac 5's father, and he told the Legion that they would have to team up with him, because Mordru had become so powerful, or would become so powerful, that if they didn't team up together to stop Mordru, that he was going to take over everything. And I thought that was a really cool idea, that there's basically two villains who are so powerful that whichever side the Legion joins with can destroy the other one, but then that would leave this villain so powerful that he can conquer everything. And so that became a storyline that I was starting to suggest, and make one of those villains Mordru, and initially one of the other villains the Time Trapper, and to just say that both of them have enough power that if something isn't done to one or both, they both have enough power to, conquer everything in their path and to take over the entire universe. And so that was one element of what we did with Mordru. And I think Keith's take on Mordru was, again, a hugely powerful character, but one who had to be building his powers and not overextend himself until he was ready. So he was watching the Legion, fearful of the Legion coming back together again, trying to disrupt them from coming back together again, but he didn't want to overplay his hand and have the Legion come in and take him on before he was ready for it. So it was really an interesting dynamic to see Mordru sort of craftily and carefully trying to build his power and stay out of the way of the Legion long enough to become, powerful enough to conquer everything that he wanted to conquer.
We know there's the scene where Rock, Cosmic Boy, is negotiating with Mordru. And Rock is not in what we would consider his traditional position of strength, because I don't want to spoil it for anybody who's going to pick up the stories for the first time. and yet he's able to accomplish something against Mordru. Is that the dynamic that you're talking about?
Yeah, that was the moment, Mordru was kind of impulsively, doing some pretty horrible things to some of the ex-Legionnaires. And, his rage was reaching out and doing things that the Legion had to stop. And he ends up realizing again that he's sort of overplaying his hand, and that if he doesn't pull back, the Legion's going to come in. They're going to organize enough power to take him on then, and he wasn't ready. And again, I'm kind of spoiling it, as you say, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because I'm sitting here just talking as if the whole world has read all these stories, and we hope a lot of people will pick them up now and enjoy them for the first time. So I'll say no more other than, yeah, that's what Mordru was facing at that point, was, biting off a little more than he could chew right then. And as you say, he's up against a Legionnaire who has no superpower anymore. And yet Rock, has to be resourceful and figure out how to stand up to this, one of the most powerful beings in the universe, and get him to back down. So yeah, that was one of Keith's most creative issues, and was a real challenge for us. When people read the issue, there's 3 text pages within the issue that cover some of the key developments. And that was a challenging and rewarding issue to work on.
I've noticed that several of the comics I read now commonly use text pages. The new X-Men version has text pages. Red Sonja has text pages. The Last God has text pages. But maybe it's just my memory and a certain degree of not paying attention at the time, but I don't remember there being text pages as commonly as were in these books, because you had the text pages in that story, and then there were text pages that were like journal entries or newspaper articles or things like that, that kind of helped explain the changes in the world, so you didn't have to do an info dump in the story.
Right.
Who came up with that idea?
That was Keith. And as you could imagine, the way we described the thing starting out, and he had, these dozens of characters and all these storylines in mind. And he didn't have a lot of interest in, having to explain all that and lay that all out in the, in the story itself. So from the get-go, he said, okay, you guys are going to do some text pages for me, and we're going to, this background's going to be, on this text page, and this will be on that. So absolutely Keith's inspiration. And it was, whether he did it consciously, it was really a good use of our talents, because what we have, I think, as a strength is to capture voices that were, Keith recognized that we had a talented dialogue, and that's what the text pages were. If you wrote a journal entry, you were in the voice of that person writing the journal entry. If you were doing a news article, I was working at the time as a reporter, so I had the ability to write something that had a credible journalistic structure to it. And, as part of my reporter background, I read police reports. So I could do a police report. There were a lot of medical entries, and Mary was working as a nurse, so she was able to apply that expertise. So it was, I think it was more serendipity than anything else, but it was really a chance for Keith to tap into, a lot of the talents that we brought to the table. And as you say, find a really different way to lay in all the background than, have characters, talking about it back and forth in the middle of the story.
Yeah. Let's switch gears for a minute, because there were some developments during your run on 5 Years Later that kind of shook up the DC universe. And the one that comes most readily to mind to me is the abolition of Superboy, the retconning away of Superboy, who played a key role in the classic Legion. And so if you all could explain for newer fans his importance, because there are a lot of fans who never read a Legion where Superboy played that role. Right. And then kind of explain what happened, that would be great.
Yeah, as way back at the start of the our discussion, we talked about how the Legion was initially a gimmick story in a Superboy comic book. And for the first several years, all the Legion appearances, or the vast majority of them, were in Superboy, Superman, Jimmy Olsen, Superman family comics. And through most of the first 3 decades or so of the Legion's history, they were Superboy stories, or Superboy was a featured character in the Legion. So he was real vital to the very early days of the Legion. And as the years went on, he was usually one of the more prominent characters. And the big development that occurred preceded us, which was when John Byrne relaunched Superman, he established that there had not been a Superboy. And so the prior creators were in a situation where they had to figure out a way to explain how there really wasn't a Superboy, even though the Legion history was so dependent on Superboy. And they came up with a storyline where there was a pocket universe, and the Time Trapper was, when the Legion would travel through time, they were going not back in time in their universe, but into a pocket universe. And that's where the Superboy came from. And during our run, essentially what went on was there were enough issues between what the Superman people were doing and what our comic was doing, that eventually they said, you know what, you guys just need to stop using Kryptonian references, period. Just leave Krypton and Superman and Superboy and anything Krypton related out of your story. And if we'd been smart, we probably would have said, well, let's just go forward and just avoid the topic. But we already had a number of stories that had flashbacks and had tie-ins to the past that would make it pretty hard to have no Kryptonian references at all. So when the day that Keith had gotten this edict that we had to get rid of the Kryptonian stuff, he called us up and he said, what would you think of like changing the history so there was no Kryptonian elements in the Legion's past? And we said, that has possibilities. And I think the next day you drove me up to work for some reason, and we were talking, and we came up with a basic storyline where the Time Trapper gets wiped out and everything he's ever done gets wiped out. And I was just referring to the storyline about how Mordru and the Time Trapper are these two forces that each one of them is powerful enough to take over the universe. Well, if you get rid of this one, what happens? This one takes over the universe. And so when they kill the Time Trapper, Mordru takes over. The Time Trapper is taken out of the timeline. He's not there to stop Mordru's rise. Mordru takes over everything. So all of a sudden you're reading an issue and the Time Trapper gets killed. You open up the next issue, all of a sudden Mordru's running everything. And the characters in that issue have to figure out that this is what's happened and find a mystical way to reassemble all the pieces that were lost when the Time Trapper was killed. And so we start laying in a character from a different planet who's not Superboy and a version of Supergirl. And we put in all the things that would have existed, but with no Kryptonian background. And in the course of 2 issues, we broke apart the old history, took out the Kryptonian elements, put them back together with no Kryptonian elements, and then resume the story from basically the same point. And yeah, it was a challenge, but it spurred us on to do one of, I think, the single best stories we did, which was that issue number 5 where Mordru is ruling the universe. And that's one of my favorite issues. That was a cool one.
Well, you all managed to keep, and by you all, I mean the entire creative team, because I know it was a group effort. You frequently said that. Yeah. You managed to keep the story anchored, even with having to do that, in a Legion that longtime fans would recognize, but that would not throw off new fans. And was that a deliberate effort, or did that just develop that way?
Yeah, I would say that, again, it somewhat did just sort of evolve organically. There were so many ideas and so many ambitions that a lot of it just sort of happened. But I think absolutely from the get-go, Keith's idea and the idea of the DC executives who were working, and accepting what he wanted to do was to create a jumping on point, is to create a place where people could say, oh, here's something new and different. It looks interesting. I'm going to try it. So yeah, bringing in new fans was always really a goal. And a lot of the older fans who didn't like what we were doing couldn't imagine that new fans could follow it and could get into it. And I think they underestimated the degree to which, if you bring on someone named Rock to these new readers, he's just Rock. And the fact that he used to be Cosmic Boy doesn't really matter that much to the new reader. Well, to the old reader, they can't imagine how, they don't even know that that's Cosmic Boy. Well, they didn't need to know. And over the years, we're finding more and more people who weren't writing letters and weren't in the APAs back then, but who did pick it up at that time and who did really love it. And it was a challenging series, and almost to a person, they'll say, yeah, it was complicated. I had to work at it, but we're just meeting more and more people, especially online, that, yeah, they were new people. They were pulled in, and it really got them into the Legion to have started with this series.
Well, as a longtime Legion fan, I never particularly found the White Witch a very engaging character. And no offense to the White Witch's fans, because, we all like what we like. Mm-hmm. But what you all did with the White Witch in this series gave her more depth and more complexity, more trauma, yes, but sometimes that's how people develop their characters. And was that a plan when you started this more mystic emphasis in the story, or was it one of those things that just developed as you went along?
Yeah, I think Keith had a pretty specific idea from the get-go that she was, to tell a story about an abusive relationship between her and Mordru. And there historically had been a history between her and Mordru. And I think I sort of sense, and certainly our involvement was to take, the old cornball superhero, supervillain dynamic and start making it really relate to the world. And instead of writing comic book evil, write about just the terrible things that happen in real life. And abusive relationships are one of those things. And I myself, I don't think I'd had the courage to write that comic book story, but Keith did. And I think he wanted to explore that. He wanted to show the world that these relationships exist, and that that's part of what, real heroes fight against, is to end these abusive relationships. And so that was, I think, the starting point. She was locked in an abusive relationship with Mordru, and she, together with the Legion, were able to extricate herself from that. And then, as you say, even deeper into the series, she has more and more difficulties and traumatic experiences, but she's finding herself, she's growing, she's reclaiming her power by overcoming the traumas that she's had to endure.
Well, and for me, it was doubly effective because it wasn't a one and done. It was a story that developed.
Yep.
And I know that there are increasing numbers of fans who say, can we just have a one and done some of the time? Not necessarily with regard to the Legion, but across the market.
Yeah.
Did you find that, knowing that most of these stories and arcs were not one and done, that you had to think 2 or 3 books ahead as you were doing the dialogue and conferring with Keith about the plot on the book in front of you?
Yeah. That was really a challenge, and something we really had to do was to have in mind where things were going and to try to be accurate in what we were foreshadowing. That was one of the reasons that we spent a lot of time on the phone, going over what Keith was aiming to do. But it was difficult and hazardous with Keith, because he is such a restless, creative mind that as often as not, before the storyline got wrapped up, he'd get tired of the ending and change the ending before we got there. So, but I don't think we ever really foreshadowed something and it ended up being inaccurate. But he would, you know, if you couldn't hit a curveball, you were going to strike out when collaborating with Keith, because you got a lot of curveballs from Keith. He was definitely interesting. But as a reader, I'm really fond of one and done stories myself. And we ended up putting a fair number of them in there because for various reasons, we had to do fill-in issues. And the fill-ins would tend to be single issue stories. So I think what the readers would have loved is the complexity and the ambition of what Keith was doing in the ongoing story in a one and done, you know, kind of a package. And they got that occasionally. Number 5 was a single issue, self-contained story. Keith laid out one of our Tenzel issues that was pretty much self-contained. So they got a little bit of that, but yeah, definitely a mix of single issue and multi-issue.
Well, switching gears for a moment, let's look at one of the biggest developments in the series. You blew up a planet. I don't know if you want to say what planet it is, but how did that come about that you just all decided that this planet was toast?
The Keith says, and I don't really remember it happening this way. He says when they basically told him that he was going to be off the book, that he did this as kind of a going away present. And I don't really think that's what happened, because it was being planned for, my recollection was for like a couple years. We knew this was coming. And you can see the foreshadowing, and I'm rereading the omnibus myself, and I'm surprised how much foreshadowing there is, because I'm like 7 issues before this event you're referring to, and they're talking about the things that end up accommodating this disaster. So it was in the works quite a while. And I don't think there was any real creativity to it beyond just, again, you know, just shaking up the universe and just, you know, saying, okay, you've gotten this far, you know, you thought we were finally, you know, back to normal. Well, guess what? No, we're not. So.
Well, you know, surprises are always good. But there was actually something I meant to ask Mary when we were back on characters, which is Kent Shakespeare. Were you the moving force behind Kent Shakespeare? No?
No, that was Al Gordon's character. We had nothing to do with Kent or Ivy or any of the characters that were in his domain.
And one, it's logical for you to guess that, because there's a lot of medical detail involved in Kent's background, but Al Gordon has some medical education as well. So Al came up with Kent. Ivy was actually Keith's.
Oh, okay.
Although they interacted a lot with Kent. But yeah, Al Gordon came up with Kent Shakespeare, and if you get the chance to interview Al, he would not be shy about giving you some background about where Kent came from and his other characters. He also created Celeste Macaulay. Right. And as I said, he had a lot to do with the storyline for Joe. And yeah, he had a lot of input into the overall mix.
Well, cool. When you all were collaborating together, one of you would write the dialogue for a scene and then the other one would go over it? Were you writing parallel scenes at the same time, or how did that work?
Yeah, typically I would rough draft the dialogue and then Mary and I would read it over, and there was never a lot of time. You would almost always get the photostats of the pages and you would have a day or two to dialogue them and get them in. So you basically wrote pretty darn quick, and then before we would print it up and send it off. And I guess back then we did print it up But the very end, we would send via the internet. But back then, you would
Right.
literally print up your pages,
Right.
and we would actually read them back and forth to test how natural dialogue sounded.
Right.
And Mary was, you know, a really good editor in that sense, to get usually what I had written, you know, to sound better and to pick out the clumsy parts, try and figure out how clearly we were telling the story. And the time that you did as much of the writing almost as I did was in the source book.
Right.
There's a Mayfair source book, and we did hundreds of entries in it. It's basically told like an endless series of text pages, and lays in the background of all the characters and the settings and so forth through basically kind of text page like entries. And we didn't have a real generous deadline. And so Mary and I would just sit down, and our goal was to write 5 entries a day between the two of us. And we trade them back and forth and edit and make suggested changes. And then the next day write 5 more and trade them back again. So that was an intense experience, but it was fun to, and the time we did the most collaborating, I think.
Yeah. The most
Well,
writing I did. Yeah.
Yep.
I'm sorry, Mary, what were you going to say?
I just said it was the most writing that I did.
Ah,
Actual writing instead of editing and
Feedback
and stuff.
And some of the text pages, the more medically oriented text pages, generally Mary wrote.
well, do you all recommend, in writing terms in general, for a second, let's talk about that. Do you recommend that people read their pages out loud? Because some writers swear by it and some writers go, oh, I could never do that. So just writing in general, do you think that's a good technique to at least try?
Yeah, and especially in the very narrow realm of script writing, you know, when you're trying to recreate human dialogue, it really helps to hear that dialogue. If you're writing a novel and you have an omniscient narrator, maybe not. I think for me, in that omniscient narrator, I more sort of read aloud in my mind, not physically aloud, but you try and hear the words in your mind a little more. But yeah, dialogue, I very much think it helps to hear it out loud.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry, I talked over you again. I apologize.
I just said I agree. I agree.
Well, you all also wrote Legionnaires, which we've alluded to a couple of times. And weren't they known as SW6, or am I?
Yep.
Oh, good. I'm not confused. That's good. And it's tonally very different from 5 years later. Were you writing those at the same time?
Yeah, and Legionnaires came after basically the end of the true 5 years later period, where Keith was the creative force, and Keith had left the mother book by the time Legionnaires launched, but Legionnaires was an outgrowth of the mother book. Way in the very early days, they were going to have a second series that was going to be origins of all the characters, and each month you'd learn a new origin, and that was a way to not have to retell every darn origin for all the new readers. But over time, that morphed into, well, now we have a new timeline. Let's retell the timeline. Let's retell the history. And then over time, that morphed into, gee, we have these SW6 kids in the main storyline. We could launch them into their own series. And so that eventually became what the second book became, was this younger group that got introduced into the main storyline. And there was a real sense of, we felt like something special was going on with the 5 years later Legion, but there was a vocal contingent that wanted more traditional stories. And there really was a sense of, you really can have your cake and eat it too. There's no reason why there can't be 2 series. There's no reason why you can't explore both flavors of the Legion. They're, for me, they're both great and they're both worthwhile. So, we were, as creators, we were in heaven. I think as fans, we would have been very pleased to have access to both of them.
Well, you all wrote some other books too. The Legion's not all you've written, and DC's not the only company that you've written for. What are some of the other projects that you worked on?
Well, let's see. Our biggest other DC project was The Heckler, which we did with Keith, which was quite a humorous book, and we really enjoyed that. We did one issue at Marvel. We did a X-Force annual where they crossed over with the Champions. At Image, we did several things with Eric Larson. We did a Dragon story. We did a miniseries called Star. We worked with Keith on Super Patriot. We worked with the Rob Liefeld part of Image on some of the Youngblood titles. We did an issue of Supreme. At Topps, we did Jurassic Park comics and Xena comics. For Dark Horse, we did, I think, one issue of Johnny Quest, and we also did a Alien miniseries. We also, with our friends Ken and Mercy for Evolution Comics, did a hero called the Green Ghost, did a couple issues of that. And for Disney, we did Chippendale's Rescue Rangers.
We did also with Joe Caroni, who is now doing Star Wars illustrations. We did a series called Dead Kid for
Sky Comics.
Sky Comics. Yes.
Just to confirm, you'd like to call Deb Tierney.
No.
Who would you like to call?
Nobody.
I would suspect that our technical genius can edit that out.
Shut up, Siri.
He's had to edit out children walking back and forth.
We earlier on, my timer was going off too, so we should have muted our phones before the interview started.
My phone is muted. Siri just doesn't know when to shut up.
Well, if it makes you feel any better, I muted mine, but I'm in full screen view, so I can't see the clock on the computer. So every once in a while, I push the button to see how we're doing on time, because, this is fun, but we don't want to give Jim 2 hours to edit, and
Yep.
I don't want to keep you all sitting here for 2 hours. So, okay, let's start fresh. If each of you could pick one character of all the characters you've written to do a one-shot for, and that doesn't mean you don't like any other characters, but I would like to do a one-shot for this character, who would it be?
I can't really narrow it down to one, because oh gosh, I'd like to do a Laurel Gand, and I'd like to do Computo, and I'd like to do, and well, that's kind of two. Kono would just it'd be hard to narrow it down.
The true and honest answer is very boring, which is Tenzil Kem, but I'll put that aside and say another one I would love to do, because again, Keith took my initial idea. Devlin Orion, a character I created, initially was a reporter for, we initially called him the Daily Planet, but the Superman people said, don't use Superman elements. So he became a reporter for the Interstellar Press. But Keith had him be doing stories that helped expose the corruption of EarthGov. And I realized if I were writing a comic that starred Lois Lane, Clark Kent, or Jimmy Olsen, this is what I'd write, is them, blowing the lid off of supervillain kind of stuff in a really journalistic way. And a Devlin Orion series where he did that would be a lot of fun.
Well, the omnibus is out. It's giant. Do you have a copy that you could show to the folks at home?
Yeah.
I just happen to have a copy here. There it is, and it weighs a ton. It's 1,400 pages long. I sent a copy to my sister and I said, do not drop this on your cat.
Or on your foot, for that.
Or on your foot.
Yeah, you could literally kill a cat with this book. So, but yeah, it's very nicely done. It includes a lot of elements, even people who have all the issues. It has extras like the Who's Who entries. It has the very hard to find postcards that they put out during our run. So it's very pricey, but it's for fans of this, it's a good buy. And if you're really intrigued and can afford it, it's a lot cheaper than going out and buying every individual issue as a back issue.
That's for sure. So what are you all doing these days? What keeps you busy?
Making masks.
Like COVID, pandemic masks?
Yes, yes, yes.
Mary contributes to a local operation called Mask Erie, and you have sewn.
About 600 masks now.
Wow.
So I've kind of slowed down a little bit because it's like we're all getting kind of worn out and burned out, especially when the school district asked for 11,000 masks. We were like, what?
Oh my gosh.
So
Wow.
we're up to, I think the last count was 6,000 for the district. So we're getting there. We're getting there.
And Mary has done some superhero themed masks, and they're even selling them to raise money for the effort at the local comic book shop.
I haven't talked much about it because they're not real enthusiastic, as you know, about selling the stuff. So this is like, it's a donation. You get a mask for a donation, and then I give the money to the group. And I don't know what she's using it for, probably buy more yardage and stuff.
Yep. And I work for NBC in their publicity department. I specialize in the Nielsen ratings. So when NBC has a TV show on and you see a story in the press, like about a week ago, stories about Saturday Night Live having its highest rated season premiere in 4 years, I was the one who put that information together and circulated it to the press and answered their questions. So that's what I'm doing these days at NBC. And we're still in the comic appas, or I am, and somewhat active on the internet and so forth as well.
You have a website?
Yes, I have a live journal blog called It's Okay, I'm a Senator. And if one were to Google that phrase, It's Okay, I'm a Senator, you'll see it come up on a Google search, and you can find it. And yeah, it's got recollections of just about every issue that we wrote of the Legion at this point.
Well, thank you. And thank you so much for joining us tonight. I just thought with this omnibus coming out, this was a great time to talk about this series. We really appreciate you being with us. And
yeah, it's a pleasure. And we sure thank you for having us.
Glad you could make it. And for the folks at home, the Continual Comics track is sponsored by Heroes Aren't Hard to Find and their annual Heroes Convention, and we're grateful for their support. You can find out more information about Heroes at www.heroesonline.com.